Hey there, I'm Dan Chambers, and this is 10-Minute Bible Bites, the vidcast that unpacks God's Word 10 minutes at a time. And thank you so much for joining me in Bible study today as we continue to unpack Matthew chapter 24, one of the most misunderstood chapters in all the New Testament. And we're going to pick up where we left off our last time that we were together. That would be in about verse 30 of chapter 24. We are unpacking verses 29 through 31. A section of Matthew chapter 24 that sounds, as I said back in the last episode, sounds like to modern ears like a real description of the second coming and the end of the age. But as I have been emphasizing, I emphasize again that the events are explicitly dated to this generation, the generation that was alive when Jesus was there, verse 34. And it's also tied to what Jesus was talking about in verses 15 through 28. It's tied to the tribulation of that section and those days of that section with the statement in verse 29, but immediately after the tribulation of those days. So let's look at verse 30. Okay, we talked about verse 29 last time. Now let's look at verse 30. We saw the language of judgment in verse 29, just typical Old Testament metaphorical language that was used when God would be describing himself as coming in judgment on Babylon, Edom, Egypt, whatever. Well, here he's coming in judgment on Jerusalem, on Judea. And the climax of that judgment is the destruction of the temple. So let's look at verse 30 then. It says, "And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky with power and great glory." Okay, now let's just kind of pick this thing apart. The first thing that I want you to notice, it says, the sign of the Son of Man will appear. Notice that it's not a personal appearance of Jesus. It is a sign of the Son of Man. It's not the Son of Man will appear. It's a sign. So that's the first thing that you need to notice. I've underlined sign. And I even jotted a note down, and you might want to do that later, drawing a little arrow from sign that says, not a personal appearance, it's a sign. Okay, the next thing that I want us to look at is this little prepositional phrase, in the sky, in the New American Standard Version. Okay, in the sky, the word sky here, it's the same word for heaven. And so, depending on your translation, it'll say either in the sky or in heaven. I know the English Standard Version says heaven. And so what we have to ask ourselves as we're looking at verse 30 is, in heaven, or in the sky, in heaven, what's this talk? What's going to appear there? Is it the location of the Son of Man, or is it the location of the sign? That's really important. And it could be either. Grammatically, it can be either. Either it says the sign's going to be in heaven, or it's talking about Jesus is going to be in heaven. Okay, now, let me let's connect the dots and put all of this together. And let me suggest to you what's being said here, what fits this. What this is saying in verse 30 is that when God comes in judgment on the temple and destroys it, it's going to be a sign that the Son of Man is in heaven. In other words, it's going to vindicate the fact that Jesus really is who he claimed to be. He is the Messiah. He is the chosen one. Remember, he came and the Jews, Israel, largely rejected him. They rejected his claim of being the Son of Man. And so the time is coming when Jesus will be vindicated, that everyone will be able to see that he really was who he claimed to be. This is going to be that moment when the temple is destroyed. It will be a sign that the Son of Man is in heaven. So the sign in heaven is not a location of the sign. In heaven is a reference to the location of Jesus. That is, when he ascended to heaven and he sat down at the right hand of God and was glorified there, and he is reigning there as the King of Kings. This is going to be a sign of that. This is going to be a manifestation that he is the Messiah that the Jews rejected. Now, I want you to, does any English translation say that? Well, yeah, the American Standard Version, and my guess is you don't have an American Standard Version. You can access it through like Bible Gateway. The American Standard Version was published in 1901. It's not many people have it anymore because, as I've heard some people describe it, it's great Greek, great Hebrew, bad English, and it really is a tough version to read. The readability is not good at all, but it's a very, very literal translation. Let me tell you how the American Standard here, which has always been respected as being one of the most literal translations you could get, even again, though the readability is not great, and that's an understatement. But here's what the American Standard says about this, or translates it. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. That's exactly right. Now the ESV comes really close to that. The ESV says, then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man. So the ESV translators have that what appears in heaven is a sign. The ASV translators has what appears in heaven is the Son. Same words, just that little prepositional phrase is moved around. English Standard Version, then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man. American Standard, and then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. Well, given the context and given the discussion of what God's talking about, what Christ is talking about on this occasion, the American Standard Version fits what Jesus is discussing. That this is a time when God is coming in judgment. The climax of this terrible day, these terrible events in which Jerusalem and the temple is going to be destroyed. The climax of that is going to be the destruction of the temple. Jesus had mentioned that earlier in verse 2. That's what started this whole conversation, this whole discourse, that the temple is going to be destroyed. And it is going to be, verse 30 is saying, it's going to be a sign that Jesus Christ is reigning. Now look at the second part of that. They're going to see the Son of Man coming on the clouds with power and great glory. Okay, they're going to see the Son of Man coming on the clouds. Okay, there's something else we need to talk about here real quickly, and that is the imagery of coming on the clouds. This, again, is Old Testament language, typical Old Testament language. I'm going to turn over to the book of Isaiah. Feel free to turn over there with me to Isaiah chapter 19. And in Isaiah chapter 19, when you get down in about verse 1, this is a prophecy about God coming in judgment on Egypt. Listen to the language. The oracle concerning Egypt, behold, the Lord is riding on a swift cloud and is about to come to Egypt. So again, what we have here is typical Old Testament language of judgment. And again, that's what's happening here. The Lord is coming to judge His enemies. He is going to be vindicated as the king. This idea here, they will see the Son of Man coming. Clearly, this is an allusion to Daniel chapter 7. Let me read you Daniel chapter 7, verse 13 and 14. I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming. And he came up to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him, and to him was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom, that all the peoples, nations, and men everywhere might serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which will not pass away. That's the language of verse 30 of Matthew chapter 24. So it's going to be at that moment when the temple is destroyed. It's going to be Jesus coming in judgment on his enemies. It's going to vindicate that he is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. It is going to be a sign that he truly is in heaven at the right hand of God reigning. Okay, so that's verse 30. I know we went through that really quick. You may have to go back and look at this again as you take a few notes to make sure you got everything right. Okay, we're going to end it here. We're going to pick up our study with verse 31. And listen, thank you so much for joining me for this Bible study. And I hope you'll come back for 10-minute Bible Bites as we continue to unpack Matthew chapter 24.